Well, good evening, everybody. Whether you are here in this wonderful Frankopan Hall here at Jesus College, or you're joining us online, wherever in the world you happen to be. My name's Julian Huppert. I'm the director of the Intellectual Forum here at Jesus College. And it's just a pleasure to have you here for the first event of this term. Now, some of you know Jesus incredibly well, the place, not the theological person. For those of you who don't, you are extremely welcome in this wonderful place. We have a history that dates back to the 1140s. We were originally set up as a nunnery when we were given some land by Nigel, the Bishop of Ely. In 1496, a new Bishop of Ely, Alcock, came to see how things were going. And he reported there were only 2 nuns left. One of them was rather elderly, and the other was of ill fame. I don't know what that meant. Young woman living alone near a university, but there we are. And so he kicked the women out and turned it to an all-male college, something we have since fixed, I'm pleased to say. And we've had do come on in. We've had amazing people over those many, many centuries who've come here to think and talk about all sorts of things. These have included people like Thomas Malthus, whose works on population were so influential around the world. We've had people like Lisa Jardine, our first female fellow, and it's a brilliant polymath who did pretty much everything. Her dad, Bronowski, was also here. We could talk more recently about the band Clean Bandit, who all started off here at Jesus. Or we could talk about Cranmer. Many, many people who have thought about all sorts of topics. One theme that unites them all, of course, is an interest in how you can make things happen. And that brings me very much to the topic of tonight. Now, it's very appropriate in Jesus that we have a topic like, what the hell? We are, of course, experts, more in heaven than in hell, but we can still apply that here. And how we think about power is a topic that's been important for a very long time. Some of you may be aware of Viscount Stansgate, better known as Tony Benn, who had 5 key questions about power. Absolutely amazing person. His questions were, he said you should ask anybody in a position of authority, what power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interests do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And last, and perhaps most importantly, how can we get rid of you? And that really is the theme of what we're going to talk about tonight, the whole thing, not just that aspect. And I'm really pleased that this is part of a series of events looking at what the hell is going on with something, being put together by 2 of our speakers, one of whom, Eliane Glaser, is an author, BBC producer, and she's also a visiting fellow here at Jesus College. And she's worked with Joanna Kavenna, who's a novelist as well, to do a series looking at what the hell is going on with different topics. So we were going to be joined tonight by our very own Professor Claire Chambers, but unfortunately something's come up and Claire will not be able to join us tonight, which I agree is disappointing and sad. But we are delighted to have Phil Tinline, who is also an author and broadcaster, I think recovering from his time in the BBC. So we have an absolutely fantastic panel. We'll hear them in conversation, then a chance for everyone else to come in. And hopefully, if you join me in a round of applause, they will magically appear through this door here. So it is a great pleasure to have all 3 of you come on in order. Phil, Joanna, and Eliane, welcome.
Thank you very much, Julian. And welcome everyone to this event, which is entitled, What the Hell is Going On with Power? So I'm Eliane Glaser. I'm a visiting fellow here at Jesus, and I'm a writer. My books include Anti-Politics and Elitism, A Progressive Defence. So those are the ones that are relevant to this discussion. And I also make radio programmes at the BBC. My co-host here, Joanna Kavenna, is an award-winning novelist and essayist, and she writes about philosophy, digital technologies, and dystopias, amongst other subjects for the Paris Review, the New Yorker, and New York Magazine. And her books include Z, A Field Guide to Reality, and most recently, 7. So together, Joanna and I run a series of events called What the Hell is Going On, and we like to look at quite big subjects like power, like originality, reality and truth, the AI apocalypse, things like that. So we like to take a broad brush canvas approach to topics that perhaps we might be familiar with in the news cycle, but then it's easy to get lost in the minutiae. And also we feel that there's a lot of normalization of debates that we try and then defamiliarize through these what the hell is going on events. Today we're delighted to be joined by Phil Tinline. And so Phil is a writer and a regular broadcaster on BBC Radio. And Phil's the author of The Death of Consensus, 100 Years of British Political Nightmares, and also Ghosts of Iron Mountain, the hoax that duped America and its sinister legacy. And Phil's written for The Telegraph, The Financial Times, and The New Statesman, Prospect, amongst other places. And he also regularly writes reports for think tanks, including Demos, the Institute for Public Policy Research, and the Future Governance Forum. And he wrote a paper for them, the latter, earlier this year, entitled Power Failure, A New Theory of Power. So for this discussion, the premise that we wanted to begin with is that we appear to be living in a time which is an era which is dominated by strong leaders and tech multinationals. And yet there seems to be less explicit discussion or analysis of power than in the past. We could debate whether that's the case later. So we wanted to ask what the hell is going on with power, and we want to explore where and how power is being exerted in our era, both overtly and covertly, both in public and in private, and why this term power seems to have fallen out of fashion at a time when arguably we need it more than ever. There'll be time for your questions later. But I'd like to start with Phil. What is your theory of power?
Well, this starts from two places. It starts partly from the general sense of, of public frustration, anger, humiliation that you can see in polling continually. There's been more of it. I've come across in the last week, but particularly a report last summer by More in Common called Shattered Britain, which was very striking in the degree to which people had sort of felt a sense of disempowerment. So that's why I was writing about it. And I was obviously trying to start with a definition, and it was striking that there didn't seem to be, and I'm happy to be correct on this, but there didn't seem to be a huge amount of writing directly on the word. Obviously there's implications which are folded into thinking about institutions and so on. But I looked at the work of Stephen Luke's, British writer writing in the 70s. Very striking contrast between what he was saying power meant with what people said it meant in America in the 1950s, the argument in Talcott Parsons and so on from sociologists, and in a period of relative consensus in America in the 1950s was that power is only that which you can see visibly in contest. And Luke's writing in the slightly less complacent period, Britain in 1974, was arguing that, in fact, power has three dimensions. It has that visible, overt dimension, but then it also has a second, slightly more subtle one, which is who gets to set the agenda, and then there's a more insidious one still, which is the stuff that you actually haven't really thought about overtly, but is structuring the sort of the limits, the taboos, the shibboleths that are structuring how you think. It was curious coming across this, having written an entire book on the history of British politics changing over the course of the 20th century, because actually it maps on rather well, and I wish I'd read it beforehand. But basically, that's the two things I brought together. And I will just, because I will do this less articulately if I try and improvise it, I will just read the beginning of the report, which is these are the stages that I sort of mapped out as a way to try and think, using history, about where we've got to now in terms of the sort of vexed situation that you described. So the stages might go something like this. Step one, the problem. In the 1960s and 1970s, the post-war political model based on high taxing, high spending, assertively interventionist government hits a series of crises. It's challenged by a series of heretical ideas. This is Luke's first dimension. These ideas call for the reduction of the power of the state and its allied interests on the basis that this will solve problems and prevent them happening again. So step two is a shift in power. These heretical ideas and their political champions win power. So we're broadly talking about, in Britain, the Thatcher Project. After much contestation, these ideas become accepted as normal and can rule the old opposing ideas off the agenda. Luke's second dimension. This moves the boundaries of the politically possible. The power shift disempowers those groups whose interests were prioritised by the old ideas, like democracy of the trade unions, and concentrates power with those whose interests are prioritised by the new ideas. Some groups, of course, remain disempowered either way. Then we move on to overextension, and this is where it starts to get more towards the basis of where we are now and why things are starting to get contested again. As the new model is applied more broadly and for longer, it starts to generate problems, partly caused by what it ignores and the people it disempowers. It becomes a barrier to responding to new problems, some of which it is causing. So it makes sense to privatise British Telecom perhaps, but privatising the water industry possibly not so much. But you then have entrenchment. By this time, the new settlement is embedded in institutional culture, standards, norms, education, group behaviour. People will say things like, oh, we couldn't possibly go back to having trade unions, as the now head of the CBI said to me in an interview a few years ago, because that's just too old-fashioned. But of course, that's what people said about the free market when the trade unions were ruling in the 1960s. So these ideas just bed in. That's Luke's third dimension, as I say. This is underpinned by the fear that allowing a resurgence of the old crises, allowing a resurgence of the old crises that the now dominant settlement was designed to prevent. So much talk of strikes and of the IMF crisis. Curiously, the IMF crisis seems to be more vividly present to people than the financial crisis, which happened a third of a century later. The fifth step, public discontent, as we were talking about, as challenges to the settlement grow, it has to assert its power and its founding ideas more overtly. Politicians acknowledge public disempowerment and discontent, but feel unable to respond because the orthodox approach, based on once vivid problems and fears, has become embedded both psychologically and institutionally. Back to Luke's second dimension. There's a quicker way of saying that sentence, which is Keir Starmer. The public develops despairing theories about why they are disempowered. Extreme voices, naming no names, promise simple, illusory, all-out solutions. And then finally, is the government able to respond to this? Public discontent compels government to acknowledge that old fears and norms are no longer the most pressing concern, that the long dominant ideas they've held in place are outdated, and that new ideas emerging in response to new crises need to be heard. Do we need to have a think about the Bank of England's mandate, for example? That power maybe needs to shift again, and we go back into Luke's first dimension, which is the clash of power. So that's the basic sort of idea that you end up, you start with something which feels completely unthinkable and ends up becoming unavoidable. You have something that's unavoidable, which eventually ends up being unthinkable. But it takes an awful long time, because if you do it in a democracy, you can't achieve it by killing all your enemies, which is why it happens in dictatorships. Faster, but beds in less well.
And do you want to?
I
was going to say, because obviously you've written The Death of Consensus, which has a theory of these pivot points. And so can you just clarify then how this theory is relating to what you've already done in The Death of Consensus? It's 2022.
Yeah.
Really recommend it for those of you who haven't read it, but in terms of how these orthodoxies and heresies interrelate.
Well, the thing that I talk about more in that book particularly than I have in this, because this is more thinking about how we act in terms of actually delivering change, is the role of political fear, hence the fun, optimistic subtitle, 100 Years of British Political Nightmares. What I'm arguing there is that when you have a period of consensus, it's not predicated on the idea that everyone agrees about everything. If we in this room try to agree on everything, obviously that would fail. It's fatuous to think that a consensus could ever mean that. But there is still a nub of agreement. And my argument, and other people have argued this too, is that basically that is constructed around a shared fear, a shared nightmare, a taboo that you can't allow to happen, often with roots in the past. So after the Second World War, it is absolutely axiomatic that we must never go back to the mass unemployment of the 1930s. But in the 1930s itself, unemployment was terrible and awful, and people went to see Love on the Dole and felt very sad about it. But inflation was the bigger nightmare. Government borrowing was the bigger nightmare. And essentially the story going from the 1930s and 40s through to the 70s and 80s is of those flipping back. Obviously, it's more complicated than that. But the thing that goes alongside it and why it's relevant to power is if you have a shared nightmare that people broadly agree across the broad swathe of politics is something that we cannot allow to happen, that underpins a concentration of power. So you cannot challenge the trade union successfully, whether or not you think that's a good thing, just in terms of power struggle in the 1970s. You cannot fundamentally win that fight until unemployment is less threatening than inflation. Once unemployment is no longer the besetting fear, then you can get to Thatcherism.
But in terms of people feeling disempowered, and a question about the crises that you're mentioning and then our current crisis. I mean, you've written that the possible pivot now, the area where you would focus, is this sense of complete misery that people have, that since the financial crisis, they've been immiserated and pummeled and punished on the basis that they had to suffer because of the crisis. That's been the political idea, the tightening your belt mantra. And that is just impossible to contend with. And so is there a disparity then between what the consensus is saying, if that's the political powers, and what people are actually feeling would be the right solution?
Right, that's the battle.
That leads into a feeling of total disempowerment.
Sorry, that's the basic sort of battle of nightmares I think we've been wrestling with ever since the crash, is that when the crash happens, what does George Osborne do? He points immediately at the horrors that are taking place in Greece. You know, your borrowing goes too high, and banks get smashed up and people riot, and somebody writes at one point in that period a dystopic near future scenario, actually slightly later, when Jeremy Corbyn's Labour leader, what would happen if Corbyn became leader. And it's basically the same as Osborne's Greece nightmare, and you can see that going right back to Germany in the 1920s and inflation and so on, which is recalled in the 70s. So yeah, it's a struggle ever since the crash between the nightmare that Osborne puts forward and the much more diffuse, much harder to picture, and therefore much harder to make politically salient, quiet nightmare that people have, that you hear all the time in polling. I can't go on holiday, I haven't had a pay rise for 15 years, my job's insecure, I can't get public services to work, I feel like I'm being messed about and tricked, and I feel somebody else is, and that's when you start to get this expressed through, populism. Some other people are up to something. Other people seem to have plenty of money. How come? I'm a mug for playing by the rules. I mean, there was stuff in the Financial Times about this 2 days ago. That sort of sense of disempowerment can curdle quite quickly, and that's why it's important, I think, to have a broader story which explains why this is the case and doesn't tell people they have to put up with it, offers them a way to shift it, but offers them a way to shift it by actually challenging the people who've got too much power, not scapegoats.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's very powerful, your analysis of this pervasive sense of disempowerment or powerlessness that the public seems to feel, and, as voters, as workers, as consumers, this kind of like fake feedback mechanisms and toothless regulators about the environment, it's kind of massive problems that seem so hard to tackle. Cost of living, obviously, is a very normalised phrase, the cost of living crisis, as if it's sort of neutral in the drinking water. And also a sense of lawlessness. There's lots of recent descriptions of people just kind of standing by while people are shoplifting, and there just seems to be like the system is broken somehow. But also, interestingly, the politicians themselves, when you speak to even the people at the top, they say, you get to the top and still the levers are broken. And so it's a very interesting, kind of very generalised sense of powerlessness that we seem to, even while the public, and I'll go on to ask you about this, but even while the public seems to think that politicians have power, or at least should, exercise power, the powerlessness is shared between citizens and politicians. So then, obviously, I want to ask you about, corporate power and finance and so on, which is kind of the elephant in the invisible elephant in the room. But can you elaborate, your thesis about the public having sort of turned against politicians and the state, and this kind of mood of anti-politics that I was interested in exploring in my short book, but also the sense that strangely corporations and multinationals and big finance, apart from a kind of blip of anger after the crash, people seem to be kind of more relaxed about that.
Yes, okay, well, let's talk quickly about corporations first, and I'll go back to the other point. So, I mean, I do think you're starting to see a change here in certain specific ways, because I think what has been the case for quite a long time is that corporate leadership has been much less visible than it used to be. In the 1950s and 60s and 70s, for good or ill, there were sort of big burly blokes with slightly odd hair who ran British companies that were actually owned in Britain, and they would be on the telly and they would have negotiations with trade union leaders, and they were at least visible. You could see them, and you had some sense of who owned the company and why it was being run the way it was, even if you totally loathed it. Now we have a much more complex pattern of ownership. You have the role of private equity, you have increasing role of family offices and so on. You have a lot of British companies owned in America or owned in a very diverse way. So there's much less visibility. But curiously, actually, I think that what's happened with the tech companies in the last year, and particularly actually in the last 3 or 4 months is beginning, and whether it has wider traction, I don't know, but is beginning to change that. If you think about the row of oligarchs at Trump's inauguration, where you have Bezos and Zuckerberg and Pichai and Musk standing next to each other, and then Musk proceeds to do his Zeke Heil and wave a chainsaw around, and then does all the licenses all the horrors that happened on Grok with the non-consensual intimate images and child sexual abuse material, God help us, in January. You start to have, with him doing poop emojis in response to people complaining, you start to have a visibility around corporate power in that particular context. But on the broader point, I do think that we've ended up giving people a free pass when they misbehave. And plenty of businesses are run in a perfectly productive and good and beneficent way. I'm not trying to be anti-business in general, but I think in terms of being fair between public and private, you're right that we have got that out of kilter. And I think those two things go together. I think we end up blaming politicians for far more than it's fair to blame them for. Example of this in 2 bits of survey data, one that I did for the paper I wrote and another that Demos, I think, did recently, is who people blame for vape shops on the high street. And the idea people seem to have in their heads is that this is the council. The council goes, should we have a nice shop on the high street? No, I think a vape shop. We've only got 7. Let's have an 8th. As though they're in control of it. More people are blaming councils, and of course, councils actually, as we know, have lost more and more money and more power over a very long time. So there is a reason, I think, underlying some of this stuff, which is connected to stuff which feels quite positive. And as I was trying to say with the outline, often what we have basically is solutions that become problems. There is a whole very sort of admirable impetus in the 1960s and then again in the 1980s to challenge the onerous power of centralized authority. And we all find centralized authority thoroughly, irksome and irritating at times. But how do we process that? How do we embody that institutionally? What we did was we made lots and lots of rules, and we moved power out of the central government into regulators and quangos and so on. And so what you end up with is a position where, as you were saying, a politician takes office. I mean, it's a silly metaphor, this levers thing, but it does speak to something real, which is that people think they're in, to go back to Tony Benn, they feel like they're in office but not in power. And that's because the power sort of sits between organisations, because we've worked so hard to make sure that power is monitored and constrained, rightly and fairly, to make sure that there is not abuse. We've ended up going too far the other way and sort of neutering it. So you have situations where a government minister will say, the judges are stopping us doing what we've been elected to do, and the judges will say, well, you make the laws. And it sort of bounces backwards and forwards. Or the CEO of a corporation will say, we just have to serve the shareholders. Our role is to maximise the share price. And then you talk to the shareholders, and the shareholders say, well, we don't run the company. And so it backwards and forwards, and don't get me started on planning and housing, but, or as I mentioned before, the water company. So that actually is where an awful lot of the problem lies, is in problems, in solutions that have curdled into problems.
Yeah, can we talk then, can you hear me, by the way? Yeah, good, great, that was very emphatic, thank you. Just about the specificities of the digital age as well, because I guess we've all, probably everyone here has in some way lived through this revolution, and initially there is that cyber-libertarian, cyber-utopianism, this idea that you would have a shift in power, that there would be access to self-expression for previously marginalised voices, that you would have serious challenge to the old authorities. And then, as you write about, and again, Phil's just written a big report about the digital democratic doom loop, which is a good phrase, but this question then of what happens when you have a big paradox where there's a kind of empowerment of expression where you can like, dislike, tweet, retweet, and yet that's different in a way that you'll, I hope, explain from a democratic process. And how does that differ? And what's going on there? And where is the power really residing in that?
So you have this moment. I'm elderly enough to remember, the 1990s and how the internet sort of crept in slowly. And as you say, there was this belief at the time, doubtless perfectly sincere, that this was a sort of a new liberation. And then, and I think you find this particularly, I'd be happy to be corrected, but talking to millennials who were young in the kind of early social media era before it turned into what it's turned into, that this was really brilliant and you could just emancipatory and empowering, and you could if you were a witty, snarky 19-year-old, you could have more followers than a famous journalist, and this was kind of brilliant, you know. The question then is, did social media start, and did the sort of broader internet start as this lovely, sincere, liberatory project, and then it got taken over by evil dudes who soured it and turned it into something quite different? Or was this always inherent in the whole thing? And I think it's the latter, because of what you said, which is that on the sort of surface, a lot of this stuff seems like democracy. It seems very liberating, but it's incredibly focused on the individual. And this is the basic difference, right? It feels like liking something and voting for something is basically the same thing, right? It's you're doing something with your hand to approve of a thing. But actually, they're kind of opposite, because voting, as many of us are about to do on Thursday, voting is civic, it's collective, it's an agreement. When you go into the polling booth, you are accepting that your vote may not be the one that wins through. Your choice may not be the one that wins through, but you will go along with the choice. We all do it broadly on the same day. We do it in a public building broadly, and it has that sense of a sort of a shared ritual of agreement and consent. And we do it relatively rarely. It has a specialness to it. Liking, you can do 100 times a day. And not even setting aside the way the data is sort of ticking up in one of about 3 buildings somewhere in California, that whole way of thinking is so radically about the individual that I think what we've seen over the last 10 years is those two things becoming more visibly different. And in terms of why it's happened this way, there's a really I looked at the history for the Demos paper that you mentioned. I looked at the history of the particular design innovations which come together to construct what we now think of as social media. And it's really striking when they happen. So the infinite scroll comes in about 2006. You have the iPhone in 2007. You have the crash in 2008. And then in February 2009, you have Facebook's like, which is eventually copied by Twitter. And in November 2009, you have the retweet, which is eventually nicked/copied by Meta. And once you have those things, you start to have the mechanisms. Then you have things like autoplay and video and so on.
I mean, the team working on the retweet, for example, it's Chris Weatherall, isn't it? They specifically say this will help amplify marginalised voices.
Right, exactly.
So there's that hope.
Exactly. So he embodies that kind of, I would argue, quite naive sense that you can wire the world sort of to freedom. Whereas I think his CEO had a slightly different intention in mind. And so what happens, of course, when you get the retweet, and just to be absolutely clear, you could retweet something beforehand, but you had to click 3 or 4 keys. The point about the retweet button is it's one. So it just circumvents, hang on a second, should I do that? Is this person actually making a bit of a sad mistake that we don't want to draw attention to? I just do it straight away. So that's when you start to get Gamergate and the sort of the pile on and so on. But it's really striking to me that that is all happening at the same time that you have the journey from the crash to Trump and Brexit. Now, I'm not saying in a sort of simplistic way that social media caused those things. I think it's much more complicated than that. But I do think that there is something about the way specifically that, let's call it neoliberalism for shorthand, gets a massive shock and a massive literal discrediting in 2008. But it's at that very moment that this very individualized way of wiring how we talk to each other kicks in. And I think one of the reasons maybe politics has gone a bit mad and why we're in such a vexed position on power is that what might have happened had we not had that as our main means of expression, we might have ended up somewhere rather different, because we would have thought about power in a less individualized, anger-based, more like this conversation way.
Yeah, and isn't there something about the way that the rhetoric has flipped power into, and you mentioned at the start, there's overt power, but there's also covert or disavowed power. And I'm really interested in the way that the rhetoric creates a kind of an oppositional logic. So the internet, it was ushered in, with a sort of countercultural vibes, and it's this idea of disruption, the bottom-up interactivity being, users taking power over the sort of tech overlords, which obviously which are obviously in power in a real sense, but the sense of the kind of rhetoric of democratization that's accompanied the internet's rise. There seems to be some connection with populism here, that the way that this sort of flipping over to this kind of illusion that the people are in power, like even like your party, the obsession with listening, and the kind of ideological collapse. We won't impose ideologies, we'll just kind of listen to what you want, and then sort of and invert the sort of top-down ideological sort of structure. But and I suppose I see this rhetoric everywhere in our culture. Even in a cultural realm, like the Arts Council's policy being, let's create. Let's not have like top-down elitist artists. Let's have you creating art. So I suppose I'm seeing this democratizing rhetoric everywhere I look. And I'm interested in the relationship, or like the genealogy of that rhetoric, how that flip came to be replicated in so many different spheres, political, technological, cultural, and whether that has something to do with the problem that we have about power, where there's so much rhetoric of distributed power at a time when top-down power is stronger than it ever was. And I don't know, there's a lot there, but can you sort of unpack like this discrepancy between the rhetoric and the reality?
So there was an essay that Max Horkheimer, the critical theorist, wrote in 1964 about shopping, where he basically said that the old fairy tale of the customer is king is dead. And in the thing I'm just writing today, I was sort of saying, well, actually, the king is back on the throne. The fairy tale is back from the dead. It's just that the consumer is king in the sense that they get looked at all the time. There are constant calls on their attention, and everyone tells them they're really in power, but if they took it seriously, they might make a bit of a fool of themselves. But yeah, we do have a kind of a weird slip with this. I mean, I'm spending also a lot of time at the moment thinking about the 1890s, when you have this sort of populist rising in the US against basically the banks and the railroad barons, and they are kind of portrayed as octopi and so on. But at least in that context, and there's a lot of conspiracy theory, which is partly what I'm focusing on. There's a lot of blame of the British, curiously, and inevitably and horribly some anti-Semitism. But the basic divide between the powerful and the powerless, setting the conspiracy theory aside, is pretty clear. J.P. Morgan has power, Leland Stanford has power, me, small farmer in Kansas, being ripped off, doesn't. What's happened now is that the Leland Stanfords and the J.P. Morgans of the world go, no, I'm a populist as well. And they're able to do that because of this endemic feeling we have about the state, right? So Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, right? A man who has a fiefdom of a communications sort of network at his beck and call, is able to deride and attack and lambast our elected prime minister, who was, elected in a way that Musk has never been and never will be, as though Starmer is a tyrant, and it is worth pausing and asking how such a kind of utter crock of nonsense could be taken seriously for 1 second. And the reason it can be taken seriously for 1 second, the reason that flip has happened, I think, is because there's this very, very deeply ingrained sense that tyranny is about the state. That's why the 1890s are interesting, because that's the time when people in the States really started to identify tyranny in the private sector. Now, I'm not saying it should always be aimed at the private sector either. You aim it wherever blame is rightly due. But that's the problem, is we've ended up with the octopus going around saying he's a populist.
Exactly. I think that's the thing about populism, that you have, kind of real populism or economic populism. And then there's been a switch in that now you have this kind of, we're through the looking glass, and we have Farage, like a former investment banker, being like an ally.
Funded by a crypto millionaire to the tune of God knows how much.
Exactly, and all these figures become allies, supposed allies of the working class. And so power is kind of legitimated. And it's kind of like absurd, but also quite a successful ideological strategy, that power is legitimated through this kind of what's happened to populism. And as you say, this kind of turning against the state, which links to conspiracies, we were discussing the deep state earlier. So a lot of conspiracy theories which are about disempowerment and not having access to information and knowledge. And so that's very much bound up with a feeling of powerlessness. But that's associated, as you say, with the state having power in this sort of covert way. Yeah,
I mean, let's talk about that a bit, the conspiracy question in more detail. I mean, obviously, Phil, congratulations, paperback out. Wave, exactly. So this is exactly, and I love this because as a novelist, I love this idea, and again, this sense of, when you eject something into the world on one basis, that it's fictional, which is what your writers are doing.
Yeah.
Explain it. And then it's then elided initially. There's an uncertainty about whether it's true or not.
Right.
And then it becomes actually taken for adamantine fact.
Yes.
So can you just tell us a bit about the kind of stages of...
Okay, yeah, and I'll try and sort of use that to talk about some of what you think.
Also about this popular, and the idea of hoax as well, because as Eliane's saying, in the contemporary era, a lot of what politicians don't like is then branded, it's a hoax.
Yeah.
So this word is used a lot as a way to just remove oppositional considerations, any debate, really. You just dismiss it entirely. And the idea of the deep state as well, which again has been reappropriated in a way which, as you're saying, sort of takes attention away from NSA, big tech, sort of elision.
Yeah, exactly.
And into something else. So
exactly. I'll do that, and then deep state, then hoax. Okay, yeah. So this is a book about another book. This is a satirical hoax that was concocted by left-wing satirists in the late 1960s who wanted to sort of skewer what they saw as the kind of crazy thinking that was driving the Vietnam War and also the nuclear deterrent in the Cold War. It was prompted by shares dipping on Wall Street when it looked like peace might break out. This is called a peace scare, and their satirical eyes kind of glinted as they sat in their office on Fifth Avenue and thought, we know what we can do with this. So the book is 28,000 words long, and it took a year and a half of this guy's life to write, a guy called Leonard Lewin. It's an entirely concocted fake thing called the Report from Iron Mountain on the Possibility and Desirability of Peace. And what it says is America should be very careful, because if permanent global peace breaks out, it will do terrible things to the American economy, terrible things to American society. You would have to introduce blood games and new forms of slavery to keep young men under control, and maybe introduce eugenics and poison the rivers or invent alien scares, so you had an enemy to unite around. And if you lose war, you lose the authority of the government. It's a very sort of snarky, very sort of anti-war left-wing thing, but done with extraordinary kind of thoroughness. J.K. Galbraith was an advisor on it, E.L. Doctorow was the editor on it, etc., etc. Anyway, so this is published as though it's real in 1967. The publishers don't even tell their own publicists it's not real. So there's a big hullabaloo about it, ends up on the front page of the New York Times, investigations in the White House. I've got the memos going up to President Johnson.
Is it true that when the White House first hear about it, they're not sure if it's true or not?
Well, right, because,
sort of
I mean,
if you're
on the switch, if you're a receptionist or you're a press spokesperson, you've got to be across everything, and somebody phones you up and says there's a report that's a committee produced that was commissioned in the previous administration. Of course you're going to say, well, we better check. But that's what they wanted. That's what they wanted, was just this little tiny bit of doubt. And once you've got the doubt that it's possible that the government might have commissioned a report which says this mad stuff, then you think, well, what else do I think is mad, maybe? So anyway, it's published, as I say, as though it's real, investigations in the Pentagon and the White House and the State Department. And then people think, this can't be real. And there's speculation about who wrote it. Was it Kissinger, who's just becoming famous? Or was it Chomsky, also just becoming famous, etc.? Eventually, the guy who wrote it, Leonard Lewin, fesses up in 1972 after the Pentagon Papers come out, which is a huge leak about why the Vietnam War happened. And he sort of says, well, satire has been trumped by reality. So he thinks. But it fades away in the 70s, because obviously having too much money to spend and having to burn it all on war is a good problem to have by the time of Watergate and the energy crisis. And then finally, after trying to get it republished and failing, he's getting quite old. 1990, he at last discovers that, yay, it has been republished. It's just it's been republished by neo-Nazis who think it's real. Less yay. And he has a 4-year legal fight to stop that. It informs Oliver Stone's movie JFK. The Donald Sutherland character in the middle of that is basically citing this report, and is based on the conspiracy theorist Colonel L. Fletcher Pruitt, who was the kind of patient zero, the guy who'd given it to the far right. It influences the militia movement. There's then a second hoax based on it, which you can see in QAnon and Alex Jones and the X-Files, and etc. So it just sort of ramifies and ramifies and ramifies. The Oath Keepers have been across it as well. And what's interesting about it is they've been told it wasn't real, you know, and yet still people manage to convince themselves that it is. And I mean, I know that it's not. I have been asked in interviews, how do you know? I've got the contract saying peace hoax book. You know, I've spoken to one of the authors, I've spoken to the widow of another, and, you know, the daughter and son of another. I know it's not real. But something about the logic, therefore, is fascinating as a kind of case study, because people go, well, it's quite like reality. And then they say, it matches reality exactly. And then they say, well, it must have caused that reality. And you see this logic come round and round. And so why do people believe that onto the deep state? Because there is this very strong sense in America, and I think here now more than it used to be, that people in power mean us harm, that there is a real kind of malignity at the heart of the state. And this is why, this is what we have to, you know, get rid of, because the state is the only bit of the polity that we have any control over. You know, we don't elect anybody to run anything else. And yet, if we believe that that is where the heart of evil sits, then, you know, it's hardly surprising we've got problems. So that's one reason it became relevant. But just to go on to the deep state is a term that comes from Turkish theory about the military having too much influence, and then it ends up in John le Carré, about the British privatised defence industry, and that finds its way from there to this guy called Mike Lofgren, who's a staffer on Capitol Hill. And he writes this book about how the deep state is basically defence companies, back to Iron Mountain, the National Security Agency, certain politicians, and Silicon Valley. Now, actually, half that's not the state. But somehow we're still calling it the state. And then Trump gets hold of it and goes, no, not them. The bad guys are the civil service who won't do what I say. And so this term just gets shifted, just like military-industrial complex got shifted, power elite got shifted, invisible government got shifted. All of these things start off as perfectly sensible analytical terms, but they just get magnetically pulled onto this sort of ghostly vision people have in their heads of this evil committee somewhere in a dark room. So that's how we get to that. And then the hoax thing, I mean, it seems like a kind of thing from a very naive other world now, you know, that you could make up the satirical hoax and hope for the best. But as you say, the thing that's really striking is the way that Trump doesn't say that create a hoax and say it's real. He points at real things and says they're hoaxes. Which is
a very, I mean, again, we're back to, I think here Peter Pomerantz's writing on Surkov and that idea of the theatre of absurdism, you know, where you then, the way to demoralise and disempower is to cause everyone to doubt what is real, what is unreal. And so this is an incredibly powerful use of fiction, if you like, or the fictionalisation of things that are true, and this elision of all of these parameters, which of course are complex and should be debated, but the fact that you're constantly essentially preventing people from creating opposition because you don't know what you're opposing. And again, we're back to 1984, which recurs a lot necessarily in this, I think.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think there's, if you actually sort of think through diagrammatically what Trump's doing with the truth, I mean, I'm actually not going to be able to get this right because it's so complicated. I wrote an article about this, but you end up with him sort of saying that something that is real is fake and something that is fake is real, and then the story about how the real thing that is fake is actually real, and it's just, and it's actually probably the thing he is most sophisticated at. That and his
flipped it, it would
it's easy, but it creates this. I mean, the metaphor I often go back to from the CIA kind of guy James Jesus Angleton is the wilderness of mirrors. But the other one, obviously, is the slightly less Cambridge one, which is Steve Bannon's "flood the zone with shit," which is a very similar phrase, actually, to what the Donald Sutherland character uses in JFK. He says, you know, "Stir the shitstorm, Mr. Garrison," and that's the problem. Is you know, as soon as you do that, these guys are always on the winning side, or you know, on the have the advantage. I mean, this is, and the great irony is that the idea of disinformation itself is a brilliant gift to disinformers, because it's still a way of introducing doubt and undermining trust in truth.
Yes, absolutely. Where are we on timing?
So I just want to ask one more question, then we'll go to your questions.
I'll try and be more succinct.
No, one at a time. But
because we haven't even done what the hell happens when AI really.
Oh Christ.
Oh yeah, no, yeah.
Embraces, but maybe we can talk about that in a minute. Yes.
Yeah.
Carry on.
I mean, so yeah, I mean, the kind of disinformation, misinformation landscape is clearly linked to the anti-elitism, which has, you know, led to attacks on experts and all of that. And my conspiracy theory is that there's been some sort of ideological engineering that's gone into diverting public anger away from socio-economic power and onto the kind of cultural issues which we're all battling all the time and taking up loads of space and airtime and while there's this power grab in the background. But I suppose it's a question about this kind of anger against authority rather than the real anger should be directed at power. And I'm sure there's some gendered aspect to this that like anger towards social workers when there are abuses, that there's something about political leaders not sort of taking care of things, and that then the sort of nanny state, the people who are supposed to take care of things get it in the neck when the kind of perpetrators, kind of out of view. But I suppose, politics has become toxified, this kind of anti-political, current that you're describing, anti-state, public anger. And so, yeah, I mean, is there any way of detoxifying political and state good power or good authority so that we can, sort of divert the anger towards the right destination, which is like corporate financial power and not at the politicians who are trying to rein that real power in.
So this is why I'm interested in the original populism in the 1890s, because I think, and this is, stay with me here, I mean this carefully and constructively, but I think what we may need to do, those of us who want to push back at, the real kind of toxic populism, which is, as we know, other than in Hungary, thankfully, on the advance, is look at how populism works and take it really seriously as a kind of political set of weapons. And start to think about which of those weapons we can use without crossing the line into toxicity, without crossing the line into scapegoating, without crossing the line into conspiracy theory. Because part of the problem is that, why do people get so frustrated with politicians? Well, one of the reasons is that the situation we've ended up putting them in is that mainly what they're doing is explaining why everything's terribly difficult and they can't actually do anything, which is maddening, right? But it's also fair enough at one level because that is the situation they're in. Now, part of that, and this is where populism of the kind of crude kind can go really wrong, is there are just things that we cannot do anything about. We are a poorer country than we used to be. We are a weaker country than we used to be. We are very vulnerable in lots of different ways. We just have to sort of look that in the eye. We can't have all the nice things. We just can't because, that's what's taken us to where we are. But I also think that as I say, the kind of using those techniques to try and think about how to do political presentation in a way which takes a leaf from the populist sort of playbook but plays it back will be quite useful. So, for instance, very sort of nerdy practical suggestion, but if you think about the way that government communications work, right? The way that, and indeed policy making works, an awful lot of it is pegged around announcements. So we've got the minister's making a speech on Wednesday in Kent, they've got to announce something. So someone goes, okay, well, we'll have a buckets policy, and then we announce the buckets policy, and nobody believes it, including the person saying it, and then everyone forgets about it. And so then the following week, another minister has to make an announcement, and so they invent another policy. And it's just pointless, but it does gum up an awful lot of the civil service's time, and that contributes to this sense that you can't actually do anything even if you've been elected, and so on. So one suggestion that I've been putting forward where I hope it's useful is that instead of that, you do policy announcements in a completely different way. You have far fewer of them and you narrate them as they go. So you say, we are going to build 1.5 million houses, but then you stick on that, and every time you hit an obstacle, you narrate it from in power. You say, well, we want to build these houses in this place, and you keep it in one simple sort of story. You do it in the same place, you use the same visual cues, you use the same language, you have the same people doing it, keep the ministry in office for more than 6 months, etc. And so if you did that, then you could start to, as I say, use the sense of the enemy, the obstacle, the barrier, us fighting on your behalf kind of stuff. Get back to the basics of popular democratic politics, but do it in a way that's not kind of toxic. It's actually just telling people honestly what the problems are. And it's this massive terror at the moment, which is based on communications realities from 20, 30 years ago, that if you let anything slip, if you drop your guard, you admit a mistake, that you're lost. Actually, that's what people like. Half of the way that the media works now is sort of backstage stuff, sneak peeks, seeing people before they go on, little videos on, TikTok and Snapchat, whatever. People want to see, in a more transparent way, the kind of the messiness. Yeah. So show them.
Yeah, like the sort of good thick of it, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I'd like to take your questions. So I think there are some mics. And we'll take maybe groups of 3 questions, or at least there's 2 hands at the end. We've got 3. So, yeah. So we'll take you, and then you, please.
Hi, thanks. So I think that the tech leaders, the strong leaders and tech giants framing is something important, but maybe stops a bit short, because what really offends here, certainly this side of the Atlantic, is maybe the overt exercise of power. And on the other hand, here, the technocratic and covert exercise of power, which has been operating all along, does not offend. But the reason it doesn't offend is because the language that we use for naming it as power has been kind of hollowed out. And the Europe of old had great thinkers and practitioners on power and statecraft, the Metternich, Talleyrand, and so on. But in our digital era, the central challenge, arguably, and you've talked about it in different ways, is the restraint of centralized power, especially digitally accelerated, not least AI. But to think clearly and speak clearly about what's actually required to solve that problem, especially in that domain, but actually others too, arguably requires a sort of a recovery of the language of power that we've lost, the ability to talk and think and speak clearly about what it is. And so arguably the recovery of power, the ability to actually do things in the real world, arguably depends in some foundational way on a recovery of that lost language. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Thank you. And then gentleman behind.
I want to be very careful in what I say. I'm here for 3 weeks, and I'll visit your lovely city, which is one of the homes of deep thought for many, many years. I really appreciate the perspectives that you've brought on power and, for example, in this era, the use of social media and so on. I do think that things, and I believe, Phil, you said that it's more complicated than just social media.
Oh, hugely, yeah.
Yes, there's a very, very, very deep shift going on because of technology, because of hyperlinks, because of databases, because of AI, which is progressing extremely rapidly. And what's different today that I think will remain different forever is the top-downness is what is becoming, for whatever reason, some good, some not good, delegitimized. And it will be really tough to get that re-legitimized. I am not a fan of self-promotion, but I have been writing for 26 years on something called hierarchy. And I have gone very, very deep in that in terms of it's not just social media, it's not just likes. There are many, many, many activist groups, groups of interest, groups of practice, all over the web. And what I believe will happen over the next 2 generations, particularly because employment will be much, much more precarious, is that the power of mass opinion will grow even more than the populism of today. And sociology takes a lot longer to change than economics and technology. It comes down to values, it comes down to education, which is being gutted in the Western world, and so on. But what I say when I give conferences is that the conditions we're living in now are not going away. They are going to intensify, densify, and become more frequent. And thank you very much. I hope you remember the word hierarchy.
Thank you. And there was one up here.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm really curious what you think about the resurgence of false flags in the past couple of years. It seems that obviously there's a long, long history of false flags and conspiracy theories surrounding genuine events by actors. And we've seen a huge resurgence of this in the past couple of years, particularly on the left, where you have the past two assassination attempts against Trump in the US have both been broadly condemned as being false flags. Regardless of whether that's true or not, it seems that this plays an important role in discussions of power, because it should seem that in the 1890s that you talk about, people can name and identify power and then identify their own positionality in relation to it. And when they see other people like themselves doing things which seem to be combating this sort of power, the assumption is that this would be a recognition of, yes, okay, I see the power that you're combating and I see your positionality in relation to it. But then diverting it to like the secret third variable and calling it a false flag attempt seems, it doesn't quite fit in with all of this. So I'm curious how false flags fit in.
Sure.
Thank you very much. So we've got very briefly recovering the language of power, technological change, and the delegitimization of the top down, and then interesting question about false flags.
Right. Thank you all for those. Really, really interesting. So yeah, I mean, I agree basically with everything you said. It's absolutely not just likes. That was just an example. I do think that the way the conversation has moved recently, including from Starmer and Liz Kendall, the technology secretary, towards, and also in the court cases in California and New Mexico, from the content to the design, because that's where the power is wired, that is a useful step, because that starts to, I hope, politicize that design. And what I suggested in the Demos paper, if you want a bigger recommendation than what I said, is that, you know, obviously regulation has got to play a part in this. There is a much more appetite for that, including in AI, than there has been, I think. Polling suggests that, from memory, that about 2/3 of people want to see, you know, the government significantly assert some sovereignty, the British government, over AI. But what I suggest in the paper is that what we may need now to do is to build some sort of European-wide social media infrastructure from scratch, because the power situation that both of you have described in the US is so difficult to fight that probably seems to be the least sort of naive solution. The technology writer James Ball was influential in my thinking here. His argument is China did it perfectly well. China built alternatives to American social media. If we can do that minus the totalitarianism, which is not necessary to build a social media network and probably actually would make it more attractive. That's one possibility, but Sophia Ropek-Hewson of IPPR did a paper recently where she was suggesting that the BBC should create some sort of public service social media. So I think some quite big, bold, imaginative thinking, and a push back at the sort of sophisticated despair which says, oh, the ship sailed, it's too late, which I'm hearing a lot of, is part of that. But I absolutely agree about recovering the language of power as well. I mean, you mentioned AI in your remarks, and we haven't talked about that. It's another thing I'm trying to write at the moment about whether we're going to see a sort of anti-AI populism should be in the New Statesman fairly soon. And I've been talking to, you mentioned various groups, I've so far talked to Pause AI, Pull the Plug. I'm talking to Control AI tomorrow. I've also talked to Stop Killer Robots and Together Against AI. And it's very interesting. These people are often people with a technology background. They're generally quite young. I'd be interested in other people's thoughts here. But my impression anecdotally from my daughters, from talking to someone who did some research in Nuffield, is that young people actually are often much more skeptical about AI than the kind of middle-aged brain going, new technology, new person, they must go together, logic would suggest. So that's maybe something to explore. False flags. It is very, very striking that people on the left have said what they've said about both the shooting in Butler and the White House shooting the other day. Also striking that MAGA types have been saying the same about Butler since the Iran war started. And I think what this points us to is the awkward, difficult fact about conspiracy theory, which is it actually doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum, and it doesn't matter how bright you are. The problem is the temptation of believing the thing which fits your priors. It feels so jarring that, you know, your side is going to get blamed, your side is in the wrong, that there must be some other explanation. Another part of the problem here is, and this speaks directly to the question of power in a way, is this sort of supposedly sophisticated question that people say you should ask when something like that happens, which is cui bono, who benefits? Putting it in Latin doesn't actually make it any less silly. I mean, my stock line on this is that if you follow that logic, then Martin Luther King was behind the assassination of President Kennedy. Because what gets the Civil Rights Act through, what gets the Voting Rights Act through, recently gutted, it's having a Southern president who can break legs in the Senate, who knows where the bodies are buried and can force that through in the teeth of Southern resistance. You were never going to get a Southern president unless he was vice president, the president died. So was it Martin Luther King? Of course it wasn't Martin Luther King. That is mad and it's obscene to suggest. But that's where that logic takes you. So just thinking a bit more carefully about how we end up where we end up and not starting from the kind of implacable present. It's basically how historical thinking works, right, as against conspiracy thinking. If you were going to assassinate Kennedy, that's the worst, particularly if you're in the deep state. It's a ridiculous way to do it, to shoot him in the street with several of you standing around in coats watching. Just poison him in his bed. You know, the CIA was perfectly capable of doing that. The CIA was also actually having meetings about pulling out of Vietnam themselves, so that doesn't work either. But yeah, I think just the three things to go back to on this are the three tenets of conspiracy theory that the scholar Michael Barkun identified are nothing is as it seems, nothing is accidental, and everything is connected. And if you start kind of, the problem is that kicks off your synapses because that's like a really well-constructed story. If you're writing fiction, that takes a lot of work to get those three things. But if you're doing it as a journalist or as a historian, your alarm bell should go because life is full of accidents and coincidences.
I'd like to take another brief round of questions. So there's one over here. Any women? So there's one over here, one up there, and do we have one more? And one over here.
So when the bad guys use wrong or illegal methods, how do the good guys fight back without resorting to the same thing? And a case in point might be gerrymandering.
Okay, thank you.
What role should education take in us claiming power back?
Thank you. And then finally.
You've talked quite a lot about sort of the digital sphere and AI and sort of institutions and stuff like that, but you haven't touched so much on the bigger concerns for my generation, which are the climate, and I don't know if this is mutual because there's not much talk about it, but the war and stuff
Sure.
like that.
Sure.
And you made an interesting point about war not necessarily being something that we're sure is a bad thing anymore. And you don't hear much sort of opposition to the Iran war and stuff like that. But
Okay.
in my, obviously, I'm not sure if you're sort of allowed to ask that now and stuff like that. But I was sort of wondering your take on whether sort of those things are linked up with power as well.
Thanks very much for those. So we've got good guys fighting back, the role of education, and yeah, thank you for bringing in climate and
quite right.
war.
Okay. Very, very good question indeed, because that's exactly where the sort of nasty, queasy, ticklish line lies, right? Because it's the easiest thing in the world to go, oh, we'll just jump down into the gutter and do the same thing. It's also the easiest thing in the world to say, we are above this, we will just stick perfectly to the rules. And in practice, politics is, you know, messy and case by case. So I don't have any great insight to offer. I just think we have to basically, on the principle I was talking about before, go as far as it seems possible without crossing the line. But I'm not suggesting there's an easy way to do that. I mean, I think maybe off the top of my head, you could say, if you gerrymander, we will do the same back to the same number of seats, and we will reverse it as soon as you reverse it. But I mean, you know, there's no good answer to that question. But it's a very good question for that reason. What role should education take? Teaching people to think critically, right? I mean, that's sort of essential. And I mean, I do think to come back to the kind of generational differences, I mean, you know, it's a snarky and unhelpful joke that instead of banning social media for under 16s, you should ban it for people, you know, of my age. But it's quite a good joke too. It's kind of, it does point to something. I mean, you know, the level of critical literacy at its best that people under 20 seem to have, obviously my kids being paragons of this, but, you know, is pretty good. But, you know, so education in critical thinking for everybody would be quite helpful. I think some people kind of like you do your driving test again, maybe need to get some help with that. But beyond that, also just thinking structurally, not thinking in terms of the way that social media has got us to think, I think, or encouraged us to think, along with other things, is very individualized, as I was saying, quite feelings based. And there's a place for that, it's really important. But thinking structurally, telling kids, complex stories about how power works, in the Third Reich or the Bolshevik Revolution or the early Chinese state, all of which my younger daughter has done in the last 2 or 3 years, and embracing their appetite for complexity and their capacity for it, and thinking about power in that complex way. Because I think one of the reasons conspiracy theory takes off is, as I was saying before to the person who's just left, which I hope wasn't a comment at my answer, the way that drama works, the way that fiction works, is it basically has a really small number of characters, right? For an obvious reason, which is you can't do a drama about the Home Office and have 30,000 actors in it, right? It would be crazy. But to tell that story, you have to do this radical simplification. Now, provided that you keep that labelled fiction and simplified, fine. But as soon as you then turn that into how you actually think power works, you cross over into what becomes conspiracist adjacent. So just really kind of, embracing the kind of, the creative joy of understanding complexity, I guess is my answer to that. Take your point about climate, fair enough. It's such a huge terrain. I'm not sure I have much that's useful to add, except I agree that it's very important. In terms of corporations, there's a whole sort of set of things there to do with lobbying. Actually, okay, that's the thing I will chip in on that, is I think one of the forms of power that's become relatively invisible, whilst becoming more and more salient, alas, this government is a particular offender, is the role of so-called public affairs companies, lobbying companies. We saw what happened to one of them, which was a little too close to Epstein and collapsed. And I know people who work for that company, and they're decent, people who are well-intentioned. But at the aggregate level, at the institutional level, I think the role of public affairs companies is something that deserves a great deal more attention. Be interested to know, just very quickly, how many people in this room have heard of Flint Global? Okay. How many have heard of Portland? Right. My case rests. We should all know who these people are. I'm not saying wag my finger, but we need to know who these companies are and who they represent and what they do, and their role in writing legislation, their role in setting the supposed bounds of the possible. And that is directly relevant to climate. On war, I think it's a mistake to say war is bad or war is good. It depends who you're fighting. Fighting Hitler, good. Putin's invasion of Ukraine, bad. Fighting Putin, bad. You know what I mean? It doesn't get you very far, but I do think that we should hang on to both the possibility that it is absolutely horrendous and abhorrent and evil, and that sometimes it's the least worst thing. And I think we just have to hold both thoughts in mind all the time and make a decision case by case.
Thank you. Well, and thinking about conspiracy theories, it suddenly occurred to me that maybe conspiracy theories is where structural analysis has gone, a kind of perversion of the kind of structural analysis that you're doing, the system. And so thank you for bringing back a good structural analysis to this topic. So this series, What the Hell is Going On, will continue here at Jesus, I hope. Thank you very much for your questions, and thank you to my co-host Joanna Kavenna, and to Phil Tinline.
Thank you very much, Phil, Joanna, Eliane. That was absolutely amazing, a huge amount of food for thought. And that's it for tonight. But tomorrow, I hope you might consider joining us to reflect also on power. There's a theme where we have John Lord Alderdice. John was one of the key players in the Good Friday Agreement, the first Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly after peace was returned, and has spent his career since then going around the world looking at peace and how you change that. So we'll be talking tomorrow about the changing character of war and peacemaking. So do come along tomorrow. But again, thanks to the three of you. Have a very good evening.